Over the past few decades, Canada's Indigenous film industry has developed significantly, with more platforms becoming available to promote the accessibility and authenticity of Indigenous content. This guide will focus on Indigenous filmmakers in Canada, Inuit, Métis, and First Nations, and how their culture has been represented by themselves and by others. In order to familiarize ourselves with Indigenous cinema and initiate conversations about its representation, we want to ask, what makes an Indigenous film? In order to begin exploring this question, it is important to make a distinction between stories about Indigenous peoples, many of which use problematic stereotypes and trends, and the stories that Indigenous peoples tell about themselves.
The whole world is looking at us right here and now. Are we going to give up? No.
Many Indigenous filmmakers use formal aspects of film, such as story, actors, and production design, to create a culturally authentic and distinct representation of experience. This connects to the concept of cultural sovereignty, which describes a culture's right to ownership over the representation of that culture. This concept is of deep importance to Indigenous filmmakers, and yet has often been lost on their non-Indigenous counterparts. Most people are already familiar with the Hollywood style of storytelling. One tradition of Hollywood storytelling is the three-act structure, where a narrative is driven by cause and effect through three distinct phases: the setup, the confrontation, and the resolution. Hollywood narratives also tend to have a linear format, populated by characters who adopt recognizable roles like the hero, the damsel, the sidekick, or the villain. By contrast, Indigenous narratives follow different storytelling formats and are always seen as more than just entertainment. Knowledge is transmitted orally in Indigenous cultures through stories that are gifted to future generations. They are used as lessons and provide a moral through the form of traditional beliefs.
My dad used to kick me out of the house to go to church. And I was told by what I learned, what you start with in the morning, and I talk about respect, nobody can bring you that. Only you yourself can produce that respect.
Indigenous stories are collective and sacred. They are owned, known, and told by tight-knit groups and communities that share similar beliefs. There are key unified distinctions to Indigenous film narratives, especially in contrast to the structure of a traditional Hollywood film. Rather than being causal and linear, Indigenous film narratives tend to be nonlinear or circular in nature. Content is often explored in a multi-directional and contemplative manner, focusing more on the sacred and the spiritual in connection with the everyday and the land. For this reason, many Indigenous filmmakers emphasize place, exhibiting the beauty of the land they depict. In the same way that Hollywood traditions of storytelling differ from Indigenous ones, representations of Indigenous peoples have been adapted to fit a westernized mold. It is important to note that problematic representations of Indigenous peoples extend well beyond Canada.
They could have killed. Put away your gun.
Stereotyping is not simply one bad bias, but rather a cultural trend. One of the earliest examples of an American film representing Indigenous culture is Nanook of the North, made in 1922. The documentary follows the day-to-day lives of Nanook and his family in northern Quebec. Though the film is regarded as a classic, it also provides an example of an Indigenous experience adapted into a westernized format. Rather than allow experiences and events to unfold authentically on screen, its non-Indigenous filmmaker controlled and manipulated many of Nanook's practices to reflect a non-Indigenous point of view. When you start to pay attention, It's easy to recognize patterns with regards to the roles Indigenous people embody in Hollywood narratives. One typical example is the representation of young Indigenous women as the Indian princess or maiden. Some typical tropes include her innocence, often reflected by her pure connection to nature, her beauty, and submission to a white hero. The primitive other is another stereotype found in Hollywood narratives. We may recognize this in either romanticized roles, like the fierce warrior, or in demonized roles, like the ignoble savage. The primitive other stereotypes depict Aboriginal peoples as simple, animalistic, and lacking depth. They often threaten invading settlers by standing in the way of progress.
You weren't always the wise one. There is a new thinking in the beat of your drums, a new dance. I want to be told what they mean.
Even in films that intend to respect or sympathize with Indigenous peoples, such as Dances with Wolves, some story elements have been subject to criticism. While Dances with Wolves was critically acclaimed, the film placed its Indigenous subjects in the background of a white-centric story. This brings up one of the biggest issues around having non-Indigenous people represent and tell stories about those who are Indigenous. Through many small and large storytelling choices, they reflect the perspectives and stories of outsiders rather than those of Indigenous peoples themselves. You have probably heard of the term cultural appropriation, which is the use of elements of one culture by members of another culture. The use of cultural appropriation is both controversial and powerful.
If people ask, well, why can't, Indigenous people take a joke? Yeah, we can take a joke, but at the same time, too, we're standing up for ourselves.
When people outside of a culture represent its elements, a number of issues arise. These issues range from the accidental misrepresentation to the robbing and exploiting of peoples and cultures by selling falsified versions of their music, art, and clothing.
The most disappointing thing is that it's the people who are in power who think that somehow this is a joke. I know for them it comes down to, I should have freedom of speech, But this is not what's at issue here. What's at issue is how much the Indigenous voice has always been denied in the past.
The need to resist stereotypical representations of Indigenous peoples is ongoing, and now more than ever, Indigenous artists are taking up the cause in their work. This powerful campaign by First Nations artist Casey Adams engages local Aboriginal people in combating racism and challenging stereotypes. Ultimately, Indigenous cinema continues to strive for rich and complex representations not bound to a single or simplified notion of what the Indigenous experience is. As one of Canada's most famous documentarians, Alana Sabamsawin, says, the body of work created by Indigenous filmmakers puts the power of creation back in the hands of those who are being represented. Earlier in this guide, we briefly touched on the idea of cultural sovereignty. Cultural sovereignty describes a culture's right to ownership over the representation of that culture. It means that Indigenous filmmakers can articulate their own stories on their own terms. Canada's most widely recognized Indigenous film is Atanajawat, the Fast Runner. Filmed and set in Nunavut, the film was honored at Cannes Film Festival and is frequently regarded as one of the best Canadian films of all time. The film is particularly renowned for its full commitment to representing the authenticity of a culture. With Inuit crew, actors, and usage of genuine clothing and crafts, the making of Atanajawat revived awareness of forgotten cultural practices. Indigenous filmmakers have also used their medium to document injustices against their peoples. Cinematheque, 270 Years of Resistance, is one of Canada's most well-known and important documentaries because it shares an Indigenous perspective of the Oka crisis. This became major news in 1990 when the town of Oka, Quebec, and the Canadian military tried to force the local Mohawk Nation to give up their lands and ancestral burial grounds for the expansion of a golf course and the building of condominiums.
You're gonna kill my family! Their days are coming! My family! I want my family out of there!
In Cinematheque, and in her many other documentaries, filmmaker Alanisa Bomsawin empowers First Nations people by presenting her perspective as a witness to Canada's acts of racism. In the film, she uses her voice to make sure that those who were voiceless could be heard.
Your friend.
No, I'm not going to be quiet. We have to go there. You lied to us. We couldn't go there. Now we can't stay here. Now we can't go there. Where can we go? This is Canada! Canada, a free country for everyone!
Bomsawin calls film a place where Native people can confide in each other about their grief, to share what is good about life, and by extension, share an appreciation with her viewers about how Native people can rebuild. In 2017, as part of Canada's 150th anniversary, an anniversary not necessarily celebrated by Indigenous Canadians, Cinematheque was selected as one of Canada's 150 essential moving image works. Its themes of shared emotional reconciliation circulate through several other films selected for the Essential 150 list, including Loyalties by Anne Wheeler and Foster Child by Gil Cardinal. There are many other Canadian Indigenous media productions. For example, CBC hosts a well-recognized 4-part TV series called Eighth Fire, which invites young Indigenous filmmakers to explore the nature of Canada's evolving relationship with its First Nations communities. Canada is also fortunate to have young, up-and-coming Indigenous student filmmakers committed to telling their own stories without compromise. One such filmmaker is Petey Shalafo, a Cree woman whose short film Pastime was initially subject to a rewrite from a non-Aboriginal producer who removed story elements that were crucial in expressing Shalafo's Indigenous perspective.
Tansei Sage.
Nando, Guakia.
Nistamina.
The film follows a young man who falls in love with a woman, only to discover that she is a spirit. In the rewrite, the story lost a key spiritual element that changed its intended nature. Yet insistent in expressing her own story's more authentic nature, Shalafo decided to reclaim ownership of the project and successfully remade the film with funding from the Tell a Story Hive Fund. Indigenous filmmakers not only deserve authentic representation, but also the means to tell their own stories. And fortunately, here in Canada, opportunities for inclusion of Indigenous voices continue to emerge. One of Canada's most exciting opportunities for filmmakers is with Izuma TV. This is a collaborative multimedia production model that allows Indigenous filmmakers to design a space or channel to reflect their own identity, mandate, and audience. One of the funding streams Canada Arts Council proposed for 2017 is dedicated towards Indigenous artists. This is called Creating, Knowing, and Sharing: the Arts and Cultures of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Peoples. This initiative aims to support the creative and professional development of Indigenous communities in Canada. Telefilm's mandate states, of the writer, producer, and director of a project, at least 2 of those 3 must be Indigenous in order to constitute an Indigenous-made film. However, many believe that it should be 3 out of 3. What do you think? In this video, we have explored some of the issues in representing Aboriginal peoples and cultures in film. Indigenous cultures are richly varied, and within them are stories and knowledge sacred to their peoples. Knowing this should remind us of the weight of responsibility and of the power in capturing and representing Indigenous experiences. This medium is a tool that, if used respectfully, can empower and unite.